but every one of those boats that we knocked out saved 25,000 lives. So we saved 25,000 lives every time we knock out one of those boats with the drugs pouring in, and you just have to see it. It means people say, oh, gee, do you think it was really drugs? Well, just take a look. Bags all over the place. That's not fishing equipment. There's no fishing rods on those boats. They move fast. When you see a boat with 4 engines or 5 engines on, going 40, 50 miles an hour, well, they get hit. We save 25,000 lives every single time we knock out a boat, and it's over 96% stopped by sea. We're trying to figure out who the other 4% are, frankly. And we're going to have the same success, but even quicker, because it's much easier on land. If they want to come by land, they're going to end up having a big problem. They're going to get blown to pieces because we don't.
You just watched it, and you know what we all just witnessed. So let me tell you exactly what that was, because this deserves our full intellectual fury and unflinching moral clarity. What you just heard from Donald Trump was not merely some blustery campaign rhetoric or policy positioning, or even reckless exaggeration, though the man is constitutionally incapable of speaking truth to begin with, but rather something infinitely more sinister and structurally frightening, a grotesque performance of authoritarian bloodlust masquerading as drug policy, a macabre celebration of extrajudicial killing wrapped in the flimsy gauze of public health concern, and the most damning part, the part that should chill every single person who gives a damn about human rights and the rule of law, and the most basic foundations of democratic governance, is that for Trump's statement to be accurate, the drugs on 5 boats would have been responsible for 125,000 deaths, nearly double the number of overdose deaths in 1 year. Listen to that again, because the mathematics of his moral calculus are so wildly divorced from reality that it borders on psychotic delusion, and yet there he stands bragging about blowing boats to pieces while tossing around numbers that would require every drug overdose death in America to be traced back to maybe 5 or 6 vessels, while there were 73,000 U.S. drug overdose deaths from May 2024 to April 2025, a figure that makes his claim of saving 25,000 lives per boat mathematically nonsensical, demonstrably false, and transparently designed to justify a campaign of violence that has nothing to do with public health and everything to do with consolidating power through militarized spectacle. At least 61 people have been killed in 14 U.S. military strikes on boats in the Caribbean Sea and Pacific Ocean since early September, with strikes occurring nearly every week, killing more than 100 people. Think about that for a moment, because we are talking about human beings vaporized by American military hardware in international waters, their bodies turned to ash and debris, and the administration did not provide any details regarding the U.S. military operation, the identities of the people killed, or what specific drugs were on the boat. No evidence, no transparency, no accountability, just grainy black and white footage of explosions and Trump's gleeful narration about saving lives through summary execution. And when you hear him mock the very idea that these might be fishing boats, when he says with that characteristic sneer, "Just take a look, bags all over the place. That's not fishing equipment. There's no fishing rods on those boats." You are witnessing the dehumanization process in real time, the rhetorical groundwork that every authoritarian regime lays before it, normalizes mass violence against populations it has marked for elimination. Here's what makes this particularly obscene from a policy perspective, and I want you to understand the full scope of how this represents not just a departure from democratic norms, but an wholesale embrace of the militarization playbook that has destroyed lives and destabilized entire regions for decades. Trump's post about a vessel loaded up with mostly fentanyl would be a rare example of fentanyl being trafficked by sea, and it is unlikely that it came from Venezuela or Colombia, as the State Department's 2025 report identified Mexico as the only significant source of illicit fentanyl, significantly affecting the United States. So not only are the numbers fabricated propaganda, the entire geographic and operational premise is built on lies, because fentanyl is manufactured in clandestine labs and smuggled through land routes, not loaded onto boats in the Caribbean by Venezuelan gangs. But facts have never constrained Trump's narrative construction, have they? Drug experts told PolitiFact that Venezuela plays a minor role in trafficking drugs that reach the U.S., while some legal experts told PolitiFact that the military action was illegal under maritime law or human rights conventions, and the attack contradicted long-standing U.S. military practices. But wait, because this gets even more dystopian and constitutionally terrifying when you understand the legal architecture Trump has constructed to bypass every safeguard against military involvement in domestic law enforcement. Federal military personnel will be allowed to temporarily detain and search people who are considered trespassing on the newly established National Defense Area at the southern border, effectively bypassing the Posse Comitatus Act. And the military strategy was pioneered in April, along a 170-mile stretch of the border in New Mexico, and later expanded to portions of the border in Texas and Arizona, with the newly designated militarized zone extending nearly from the Arizona state line to the Otay Mountain wilderness. What Trump has done is turn federal land into military installations, so that migrants crossing become trespassers on military property, subject to detention by armed forces. And this is not hyperbole or alarmist interpretation. This is civilian law enforcement functions that no matter how the Trump administration frames these activities, they are civilian law enforcement functions. The Brennan Center for Justice has warned that using the military for border enforcement is a slippery slope, and if soldiers are allowed to take on domestic policing roles at the border, it may become easier to justify uses of the military in the U.S. interior in the future. And now Trump stands before us glorying in the spectacle of naval warfare against civilians, promising that if traffickers try coming by land, they're going to end up having a big problem. They're going to get blown to pieces because we don't want our people poisoned, as if the solution to a public health crisis is to militarize the hemisphere and conduct assassinations without trial or evidence or any semblance of due process. Legal experts have stressed that the analogy between the bombing of alleged drug boats and the post-9/11 U.S. attacks on suspected al-Qaeda fighters has no basis because Washington is not an armed conflict in Latin America. But of course, on October 1, 2025, in the context of Operation Southern Spear and the U.S. naval deployment in the Caribbean, President Donald Trump formally declared that the U.S. is engaged in a non-international armed conflict with unlawful combatants associated with drug cartels operating in the Caribbean. Do you see what's happening here? Trump has declared war on Latin American civilians without congressional authorization, created a legal fiction of armed conflict to justify extrajudicial killings, and now he's touring the country bragging about body counts like some bloodthirsty warlord, while his sycophants in Congress nod along. And here's the part that should enrage anyone who has studied the catastrophic failure of the war on drugs across the globe, because military force and militarized enforcement are ill-suited to respond to lucrative illegal markets, and the perverse outcomes of such enforcement operations end up splintering drug organizations, multiplying the challenges to supply control, and triggering spirals of violence, consequences that may be unintended but are no longer unpredictable, since enforcement has clearly failed to curb supplies and has for decades fueled corruption, conflict, and violence. We have seen this movie before, and we know how it ends. Plan Colombia was adopted in 2000 under President Clinton, expanded under George W. Bush, and sustained through Obama and Trump's first term, costing more than $10 billion from 2000 to 2018. Yet despite this sustained bipartisan backing, coca cultivation and cocaine production in Colombia reached record highs during those years, with cocaine production tripling from 2013 through 2017 alone, and Plan Colombia brought profound collateral damage as aerial fumigation campaigns destroyed food crops, contaminated waterways, and exposed rural families to toxic chemicals, while military operations and coca eradication contributed to mass displacement, with more than 7 million Colombians uprooted over the last 2 decades. The Mérida Initiative in Mexico, launched in 2007, it funneled roughly $3 billion in U.S. security assistance to Mexico and Central America, prioritized military and police aid over economic development and public health, and homicide rates in Mexico soared to an average of 95 per day in 2020 as cartels splintered into more violent factions. This is the historical record that Trump either doesn't know or doesn't care about, and I suspect it's both because the man has the intellectual curiosity of a goldfish and the moral compass of a mob boss. But what he does understand perfectly is that violence sells, that spectacle consolidates power, that Americans have been so thoroughly propagandized by decades of tough-on-crime rhetoric and racialized fear-mongering that a significant portion of the electorate will cheer when he promises to blow human beings to pieces. And let's be brutally honest about what populations he's targeting here, because there are reports that these strikes have endangered and killed civilians, with Colombian President Gustavo Petro accusing the U.S. of murdering a Colombian fisherman with no ties to drug smuggling in a September strike. Brown and black bodies in the global south. That's who gets blown to pieces in Trump's narco-war fantasy. While public health officials point out that improvements in drug overdose deaths over the last year have largely benefited white communities, with some Black and Native American communities actually seeing drug overdose deaths rise. The hypocrisy is almost too much to process, because Trump has repeatedly overstated the number of drug overdose deaths in the U.S., with provisional data from the CDC indicating overdose deaths declined more than 24% from 105,007 deaths in 2023 to 79,383 in 2024, which means overdose deaths are actually falling dramatically right now, down by margins we haven't seen in decades, and experts say the U.S. is experiencing the biggest drop in fatal overdoses seen since the opioid crisis began in the 90s, with preliminary data showing roughly 97,000 fatal overdoses over a 12-month period, down roughly 14.5% from a year earlier. But Trump never mentions this, because decline doesn't serve his narrative of invasion and existential threat. He needs crisis and carnage to justify his authoritarian power grabs, so he inflates the numbers to absurd proportions, and when pressed, Trump repeated that he believed 300,000 Americans died from overdoses last year, when the actual number was about 80,000, according to the CDC, and when speaking to reporters he inflated that number to 300 million. 300 million, that would be almost the entire American population. And here's where the progressive movement needs to wake up and recognize what we're witnessing, because this is not just bad drug policy, this is the architecture of fascism being constructed in real time before our eyes. The Trump administration's national security strategy elevated the fight against narco-terrorists to a key Defense Department priority, calling for the use of lethal force to replace the failed law enforcement-only strategy, and Trump and Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth have justified the military strikes on civilian vessels in international waters as part of the national security strategy against narco-terrorists, but many critics say the deadly strikes are based on unverified, false, or wildly exaggerated claims. Trump has designated drug cartels as foreign terrorist organizations and declared fentanyl a weapon of mass destruction, and experts are skeptical because this is the exact same playbook George W. Bush used to justify the invasion of Iraq, the fabricated WMD narrative that led to hundreds of thousands of deaths and destabilized an entire region. The drug war has always been a mechanism of social control and racialized violence, from Nixon's explicit admission that criminalizing marijuana was a way to target black people and anti-war activists, through Reagan's crack panic that built the carceral state, to Clinton's crime bill that supercharged mass incarceration. But Trump is taking this to a qualitatively different level, because what makes the drug war so enduring despite its failures is its political utility for ruling political and economic elites, and by framing narcotics as existential threats, governments justify extraordinary measures like deploying the military domestically, expanding surveillance, and bypassing judicial safeguards. This is not about saving lives. This is about normalizing military violence against civilian populations, both abroad and increasingly at home. The Trump administration is declaring power to strike anyone associated with designated terrorist groups anywhere, and this is flawed legal reasoning all across the board, but there's no limiting principle on where and when that authority could be asserted by President Trump. So it could be in Caracas tomorrow, it could be in Chicago the next day. Think about that progression for a moment, because it's not hypothetical. Trump has already said he would deploy federal troops to cities like Chicago to fight crime. He has called for using the military against what he calls the enemy from within, his own political opponents, and now he's conditioning the American public to accept summary execution without trial as a legitimate counter-narcotic strategy. The most troubling of recent Trump comments are his suggestions that he could use the U.S. military or National Guard against the enemy from within, a classic trope of authoritarian leaders, and when you combine that with Trump saying, "We will root out the communists, Marxists, fascists, and the radical left thugs that live like vermin within the confines of our country," you are witnessing textbook fascist dehumanization. Authoritarians want to change the way people see violence and change the way people see their targets, through dehumanizing language, and this is what the original fascists did, as Hitler started talking about Jews as parasites in 1920. So by 1933, Germans had been exposed to this dehumanizing rhetoric for 13 years, and Mussolini literally talked about rats bringing infectious diseases, which matches up with Trump talking about immigrants bringing disease. So this is very dangerous rhetoric with a very precise fascist history. We are watching the normalization of state violence unfold through the war on drugs as laboratory, and every time Trump stands up and brags about blowing boats to pieces, every time his supporters cheer for extrajudicial killing, every time the media treats this as just another campaign promise instead of a confession of war crimes, we inch closer to the point where domestic deployment of military force against American citizens becomes thinkable, then acceptable, then routine. The boat strikes are a test case. They're measuring public tolerance for summary execution. They're building the legal and rhetorical framework for expanded use of military force. And they're doing it all while wrapping themselves in the language of protecting American lives, even as the U.S. now incarcerates more of its citizens than any other nation, yet also ranks highest in rates of drug use and overdose deaths. And after a brief decline in 2024, U.S. drug overdose deaths appear to be on the rise once again. The evidence is overwhelming that the war on drugs has never been just a metaphor. Latin America has been one of the primary theaters in which this very real war has been waged, and like most wars, the primary casualties are civilians, making it crucial that human rights organizations shine a light on the problem of militarized drug control and human rights violations, because drug prohibition and militarized enforcement are an especially toxic mix from the perspective of human rights. This is why organizations like the Washington Office on Latin America have been sounding the alarm. Why the Global Commission on Drug Policy declared, "The global war on drugs has failed, with devastating consequences for individuals and societies around the world," and the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights stated that decades of punitive, war on drugs strategies had failed to prevent an increasing range and quantity of substances from being produced and consumed, even as the annual U.S. federal drug war budget reached $39 billion, with cumulative spending since 1971 estimated at $1 trillion. $1 trillion spent, countless lives destroyed through incarceration and violence, entire communities devastated, democracies undermined across the hemisphere. And for what? Drugs are more available now than ever before, cartels are more powerful, and the human cost has been catastrophic. But Trump doesn't care about any of that because the cruelty is the point, the violence is the message, the dehumanization is the strategy. When he says they're going to get blown to pieces because we don't want our people poisoned, he's not articulating a coherent public health strategy, he's performing dominance through threatened violence, he's conditioning his base to accept extrajudicial killing as a legitimate tool of governance, and he's laying the groundwork for the deployment of that violence against anyone designated as a threat to his vision of America. And we need to be absolutely clear about what that vision entails, because the former president is proposing deploying the military domestically, purging the federal workforce, and building futuristic cities from scratch, and in online videos and stump speeches, Trump is pledging to pick up where his first term left off, and push even further with plans that include mandatory stop and frisk, deploying the military to fight street crime, break up gangs and deport immigrants, and purging the federal workforce and charging leakers. This is the authoritarian playbook in its purest form, and every time Trump brags about blowing boats to pieces, he's normalizing the violence that will eventually be turned inward against his domestic enemies, because that's how authoritarianism works. It always starts with the most vulnerable populations, the migrants, the drug users, the poor racialized others, and then it expands to encompass anyone who resists. So when you watch that clip and you hear Trump's casual bloodlust, his gleeful description of human beings being destroyed, his mockery of the idea that maybe we should have evidence before we execute people, understand that you're not just witnessing bad policy or campaign bombast. You're witnessing the mechanism through which democratic norms get dismantled and replaced with authoritarian violence. You're watching the war on drugs metastasize into a war on people that knows no geographic or legal boundaries. You're seeing the future Trump wants to build, where military force is the first resort against any population deemed threatening or disposable, where brown and black bodies are blown to pieces without trial or evidence or accountability, where the president brags about body counts and his supporters cheer because they've been convinced that violence against the designated other is not just necessary but righteous. This is why we fight. This is why we resist. This is why we cannot allow this rhetoric to be normalized or accepted or treated as just another day in American politics. Every boat strike is a war crime. Every life taken without trial is a human rights violation. Every lie Trump tells about saving 25,000 lives is an insult to the victims of the actual drug crisis and a justification for expanding state violence. And if we don't stand against this now, if we don't name it for what it is and organize to stop it, then we are complicit in the authoritarianism that's coming for all of us.